And maybe, just maybe, understanding that pattern will help someone else break free. Ever heard the saying, you marry your mother? It's a bit of a cliche, right? But what if the truth is a little more nuanced, a little more insidious? What if, instead of marrying your mother, you marry the opposite of everything she allowed you to be? Or, perhaps more accurately, what if you marry someone who promises the illusion of that freedom? That's the story of Clara. Clara was, to put it mildly, a good girl. Straight A's, volunteer work, piano lessons, never a hair out of place. The kind of girl who made other mothers whisper, Wodroba, quote, two. And the answer, of course, was her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a force of nature, a velvet-gloved dictator who orchestrated every aspect of Clara's life with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. From the clothes she wore to the books she read, everything was carefully curated, designed to mold Clara into the perfect, presentable, and above all, safe young woman. Now, Eleanor wasn't overtly cruel. She didn't scream or punish or withhold affection. Her control was far more subtle, a constant stream of helpful suggestions, gentle corrections, and thinly veiled anxieties. Are you sure you want to wear that, dear? It's a little bright. That boy seems nice, but is he really serious about his future? Don't you think you should focus on your studies instead of going to that party? Each comment, seemingly innocent on its own, chipped away at Clara's autonomy, reinforcing the idea that her mother knew best, that the world was a dangerous place, and that only Eleanor could truly protect her. And Clara, being a good girl, internalized it all. She learned to anticipate her mother's disapproval, to second-guess her own desires, to prioritize safety and security above all else. She became a master of self-censorship, carefully crafting her words and actions to avoid even the slightest hint of conflict. She excelled at everything she did, not because she loved it, but because she knew it would please her mother. But beneath the surface of this perfectly polished exterior, a quiet rebellion was brewing. A yearning for something more, something different, something free. And that yearning, that desperate need for liberation would eventually lead her to Daniel. Daniel was everything Eleanor warned her against: artistic, impulsive, unpredictable. He was a musician, a dreamer, a free spirit who seemed to float through life without a care in the world. He wore ripped jeans and had tattoos and laughed too loud. He was, in Eleanor's eyes, a walking disaster. But to Clara, he was a breath of fresh air. He saw something in her that no one else did, a spark of passion and creativity that had been buried under years of expectations and obligations. He encouraged her to take risks, to express herself, to be herself. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt truly seen, truly understood. She fell hard and fast, convinced that Daniel was the key to her liberation, the antidote to her mother's suffocating control. But was he really? Or was he just another form of control? A different kind of cage disguised as freedom? That's the question that Clara would soon have to face. A question that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, her mother, and the true meaning of love. Because sometimes the greatest prisons are the ones we build ourselves, brick by brick, out of the expectations and fears of others. And sometimes the key to unlocking those prisons lies not in finding someone to rescue us, but in finding the courage to rescue ourselves. The whirlwind romance continued, a blur of stolen kisses and whispered promises under the disapproving gaze of Mrs. Henderson. David seemed to thrive on her disapproval, each raised eyebrow and pursed lip fueling his rebellious charm. He'd arrive at their doorstep on his vintage motorcycle, the roar of the engine a deliberate act of defiance, whisking Clara away to hidden cafes and late-night movies, places Mrs. Henderson would never dream of going. "Honestly, Clara," her mother would say, her voice laced with a mixture of concern and thinly veiled disgust, "that motorcycle is an accident waiting to happen. And those Those tattoos. What will people think? Clara would just shrug, a newfound confidence blossoming within her. They're just tattoos, Mom, and I like the motorcycle. David, sensing the tension, would often interject with a disarming smile. Don't worry, Mrs. Henderson. I'll take good care of her. I promise to have her home before curfew, most nights. The most nights was always delivered with a wink that only Clara caught, a secret language they shared that excluded her mother. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being part of something forbidden, something that belonged only to her and David. He listened to her, truly listened, in a way that no one ever had before. He asked about her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. He didn't dismiss them as childish fantasies or impractical ambitions. He encouraged them, nurtured them, made her feel like anything was possible. One evening, as they sat on a blanket under a star-strewn sky, David turned to her, his eyes filled with a sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. Quote, Nero 12. He said, his voice soft. Quote, 13. The question hung in the air, shimmering like the stars above. Marriage. It was a huge step, a life-altering decision. But looking into David's eyes, she saw a future filled with adventure, with laughter, with a love that felt both exhilarating and safe. Yes, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Yes, I will. The engagement was met with predictable fury from Mrs. Henderson. Marry him? Clara, you're barely out of college. You haven't even started your career. This is a terrible mistake. Clara stood her ground, her voice trembling but firm. Mom, I love him, and I want to marry him. Love? You think you know what love is? This is infatuation, Clara, a rebellious phase. You'll regret this, I promise you. The argument raged for hours, a battle of wills that left Clara feeling drained and defeated. She knew her mother would never understand, would never approve. But for the first time, she was willing to defy her, to choose her own happiness, even if it meant facing her mother's disapproval. She pictured David's kind eyes, his gentle smile. He wasn't the ambitious lawyer Mrs. Henderson had always envisioned for her daughter, but he was genuine, and he loved her for who she was, not for who she could become. Quote 19. Clara finally said, her voice clearer now, stronger. Quote, 20, Mrs. Henderson scoffed. Quote, 21. She turned and swept out of the apartment, leaving Clara alone with her resolve and a lingering sense of unease. Was she making a mistake? Doubt crept in, whispering insidious questions in her ear. But then she remembered David's promise, whispered on a starlit night. I'll always be there for you, Clara. And she knew deep down that she was making the right choice. Or at least, she desperately hoped she was. The wedding preparations were a minefield. Mrs. Henderson, despite her initial disapproval, took over the planning with a vengeance. It was as if, having failed to dissuade Clara, she was determined to control every aspect of the event. The guest list swelled with people Clara barely knew. Mrs. Henderson's friends from her book club, distant relatives Clara hadn't seen in years, and colleagues from Mr. Henderson's law firm. Clara's own friends were relegated to a smaller, less prominent section of the seating chart. The dress was another battleground. Clara had envisioned something simple and elegant, perhaps with lace and a flowing skirt. Mrs. Henderson, however, had something far grander in mind, a voluminous, heavily beaded gown with a long train and a tiara that could double as a weapon. It's your only wedding, darling, she'd insisted, her voice laced with that familiar, manipulative sweetness. Quote, 24. Clara tried to resist, but Mrs. Henderson was relentless. She wore Clara down with constant phone calls, pointed criticisms, and carefully orchestrated guilt trips. David, bless his heart, tried to intervene, but Mrs. Henderson was a force of nature. He quickly learned to step back and offer Clara silent support, a reassuring squeeze of the hand, a knowing glance that said, quote, 25. As the wedding day approached, Clara felt increasingly like a puppet in her mother's elaborate play. She went through the motions of dress fittings, cake tastings, and floral arrangements, feeling detached and numb. The joy she had initially felt at the prospect of marrying David was slowly being suffocated by the weight of her mother's expectations. One afternoon, while Clara was at the bridal shop for yet another fitting, Mrs. Henderson received a phone call. Clara overheard snippets of the conversation. Quote 26. Clara knew with a sinking feeling that the call was about her. When Mrs. Henderson hung up, she turned to Clara with a triumphant smile. Quote 27, she announced. Quote 28. Clara's heart sank. She had always imagined walking down the aisle with her father, but he had passed away when she was young. The thought of her overbearing Aunt Mildred taking his place filled her with dread. But Mom, Clara protested, I was going to walk alone. I want to honor Dad that way. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Quote 31, she said dismissively. Quote 32. Clara bit back a sharp retort. She knew that arguing was pointless. Mrs. Henderson had already made up her mind. As Clara stood there, surrounded by tulle and satin, she felt a wave of despair wash over her. Was this what her life was going to be like? A constant battle against her mother's control, a never-ending stream of compromises and sacrifices. That night, Clara found David waiting for her at her apartment. He had brought a bottle of wine and a take-out pizza, her favorite. Rough day? He asked, his eyes filled with concern. Clara burst into tears. She told him about the dress, the guest list, Aunt Mildred, everything. David listened patiently, holding her close. When she was finished, he took her face in his hands and looked her directly in the eye. Clara, he said softly, this is your wedding. It should be about you and me, not about your mother's expectations. We need to set some boundaries. Clara nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. But how? She asked. She's so determined. David smiled. We'll figure it out together, he said. We're a team, remember? He opened the bottle of wine and poured them each a glass. Now, he said, let's eat some pizza and forget about wedding planning for a while. As they sat there, eating pizza and talking, Clara felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew that confronting her mother wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't let her mother control her life any longer. She owed it to herself and to David to stand up for what she wanted. The next day, Clara called her mother. She took a deep breath and said, Mom, we need to talk about the wedding. Mrs. Henderson's voice was instantly defensive. Quote 43. Quote 44. Clara said firmly. Quote 45. She braced herself for the storm that was sure to follow, but she was ready. She had David by her side, and she was finally ready to fight for her own happiness. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration of her love for David, not a performance for her mother's approval. And she was determined to make it that way, no matter what it took. Change. Change what, Clara? Everything's already planned. The invitations are sent. The venue is booked. The caterers are confirmed. What exactly do you want to change? Mrs. Henderson's voice rose an octave, a clear sign of her rising panic. Clara tried to remain calm. Quote 47. Quote 48. Quote 49. Mrs. Henderson gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. Quote 50. Quote 51. Quote 52. Quote 53. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. Is this David's idea? Is he putting you up to this? Clara's patience finally snapped. Quote 55. A tense silence hung in the air. Mrs. Henderson stared at Clara, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. Finally, she spoke, her voice icy cold. Quote 56. Clara braced herself. Here it comes. The guilt trip to end all guilt trips. Quote, 57. Quote, 58. Mrs. Henderson's voice dripped with sarcasm. After all the sacrifices I've made, all the opportunities I've given you, you repay me by rebelling like some common teenager. Clara winced. The teenager jab was particularly stinging. She was a grown woman, for crying out loud. Mom, wanting to pursue my passion isn't rebellion. It's living. Living? You call this living? Throwing away a perfectly good marriage, a stable future for some artistic whim? Mrs. Henderson gestured dismissively. You have no idea what the real world is like, Clara. It's not all sunshine and rainbows and happy little paintings. It's hard work and responsibility and providing for your family. And I can't do those things and paint? Clara challenged, her voice trembling slightly. I can still be a good wife, a good partner, and pursue my art. They're not mutually exclusive. Don't be naive, Clara. You can't do everything. You'll spread yourself too thin, you'll fail at both, and then what? You'll come crawling back to me, begging for help. And I'll be there, of course, because that's what mothers do, but don't expect me to be happy about it. Clara's shoulders slumped. This was exactly what she had feared. Her mother's disapproval was like a heavy weight, pulling her down, but she knew she couldn't give in. Not this time. I won't come crawling back, Mom. I'll make it work. I have to. Mrs. Henderson sighed dramatically. Fine. Do what you want. Ruin your life. But don't say I didn't warn you. She turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone in the living room, the weight of her mother's words pressing down on her. David found her there a few minutes later, her eyes red and puffy. Quote, 68, he asked, wrapping his arms around her. Clara buried her face in his chest and sobbed. Quote, 69. David held her tight, stroking her hair. Quote, 70. His words were a balm to her wounded spirit. David's unwavering support was a lifeline in the storm of her mother's disapproval. But even with his love, Clara knew that the road ahead would be difficult. She would have to navigate her career, her marriage, and her relationship with her mother, all while trying to stay true to herself. As the wedding day approached, Clara found herself increasingly anxious. The tension with her mother hadn't eased, and she worried about how her behavior would affect the ceremony. She wanted her wedding to be a celebration of love and commitment, not a battleground for family drama. On the morning of the wedding, Clara woke up with a knot in her stomach. She tried to focus on the joy of the day, but her mother's words kept echoing in her mind. As she got ready, surrounded by her bridesmaids, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When Mrs. Henderson finally arrived, her face was set in a stony expression. She offered Clara a perfunctory hug, her eyes cold and distant. Clara tried to ignore her mother's negativity, but it was like a dark cloud hanging over the festivities. During the ceremony, Clara couldn't help but notice her mother's disapproving glances. She tried to focus on David, on the vows they were exchanging, on the promise of their future together. But even as she said, quote, 71, she felt a pang of sadness, a sense of incompleteness. The reception was a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation. Clara tried to mingle with her guests, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was putting on a show. She caught her mother's eye across the room, and Mrs. Henderson gave her a look that seemed to say, quote, 72. Later that evening, as Clara and David drove away from the reception, she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I wanted everything to be perfect, but it wasn't. My mother... David pulled over to the side of the road and took Clara in his arms. Hey, it's okay, he said softly. It doesn't matter what your mother thinks. What matters is that we're together, and we love each other. Clara clung to him, drawing strength from his words. She knew that David was right, but she couldn't help but feel that her mother's disapproval had cast a shadow over their wedding day. As they drove on, Clara thought about the future, about the challenges they would face as a couple. She knew that her mother's influence would continue to be a factor in her life, but she was determined to break free from her control. She wanted to build a life with David that was based on love, trust, and mutual respect, a life where she could be true to herself, even if it meant disappointing her mother. The honeymoon provided a brief respite from the family drama. Clara and David spent 2 weeks in Italy, exploring ancient ruins, indulging in delicious food, and simply enjoying each other's company. Away from her mother's critical gaze, Clara felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years. She painted every day, capturing the beauty of the Italian landscape on canvas. David encouraged her, praising her talent and helping her to believe in herself. But even in paradise, Clara couldn't completely escape her mother's influence. One evening, as they were having dinner at a charming little trattoria, Clara received a text message from Mrs. Henderson. "Have you given up on David's career already?" it read. "Are you just going to paint all day while he works to support you?" Clara's heart sank. Her mother's words were like a poison, seeping into her happiness. She showed the message to David, her eyes filled with tears. David took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "Don't let her get to you, Clara," he said. "She's just trying to manipulate you. We know what's important, and that's all that matters." Clara nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her mother was right. Was she being selfish? Was she neglecting her responsibilities as a wife? Was she letting her artistic ambitions get in the way of David's career? The questions swirled in her mind, creating a sense of doubt and uncertainty. She knew that she had to find a way to balance her passion for art with her commitment to her marriage, but she didn't know how. Back home, the realities of married life began to sink in. David worked long hours at the office, while Clara struggled to find time to paint between household chores and social obligations. She missed the freedom and inspiration she had felt in Italy. Her paintings became stale and lifeless, reflecting her inner turmoil. One afternoon, as Clara was cleaning the house, she stumbled upon a box of old photographs. She sat down on the floor and began to sift through them, memories flooding her mind. There were pictures of her as a child, smiling and carefree, pictures of her with her friends, laughing and joking, and pictures of her with her mother, stiff and unsmiling. As she looked at the photographs, Clara realized that her mother had always been this way, controlling and critical. She had spent her entire life trying to please her, trying to live up to her expectations, but it had never been enough. And then it hit her. She didn't have to live her life for her mother. She could choose her own path, make her own decisions, and create her own happiness. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. Clara stood up, a newfound sense of determination in her eyes. She knew that she had a long way to go, but she was ready to start. She was ready to break free from her mother's control and finally live her own life. She started small, setting aside a dedicated time each day for painting, no matter what else was going on. She started saying no to things she genuinely didn't want to do, even if it meant disappointing her mother. And she started seeing David more, not hiding their dates, but simply living them. David, bless his heart, was incredibly patient. He understood, or at least he tried to understand, the complex dynamic between Clara and her mother. He never pressured her, never pushed her to do anything she wasn't comfortable with. He simply offered a safe space, a listening ear, and unwavering support. He was the antithesis of everything her mother wanted for her. And yet, he was exactly what she needed. He was calm where her mother was frantic, supportive where her mother was critical, and understanding where her mother was. Well, just generally overbearing. One evening, David took Clara to a small, intimate Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was filled with the aroma of garlic and herbs. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself in conversation, where time seemed to slow down, and where the world outside faded away. "Clara," David began, his voice soft. "I know things haven't been easy for you lately. Your mom—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "She seems to have a very specific vision for your life." Clara sighed. "Specific is an understatement. She has my entire life mapped out, from the career I should have to the grandchildren I should be giving her." David chuckled softly. "Well, I'm sure those grandchildren would be adorable. But," he continued, his eyes meeting hers, "this is your life, Clara, not your mother's, and you deserve to be happy. Truly happy." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I love you, Clara. I love the way you see the world, the way you find beauty in the simplest things, the way you make me laugh. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting to hear those words for so long, but now that they were finally here, she felt a surge of both joy and fear. Joy because she loved David too, more than she had ever thought possible. Fear because she knew that choosing him meant choosing a life that her mother would never approve of. Quote in Bobby 89. She said, her voice trembling slightly. Quote 90, quote 91. He interrupted gently. Quote 92. He paused, then added, quote 93. Clara smiled, a genuine heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. Quote 94, she said. Quote 95. Quote 96, David replied. Quote 97. He squeezed her hand, and Clara felt a surge of strength and determination. She knew that she had a long and difficult road ahead of her, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had David by her side, and that made all the difference. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Clara continued to assert her independence, pushing back against her mother's constant interference. She spent more time with David, exploring their shared interests and strengthening their bond. And she started to envision a future for herself, a future that was filled with love, laughter, and genuine happiness. But her mother wasn't going down without a fight. Mrs. Henderson ramped up her efforts to control Clara, using every trick in the book, guilt trips, emotional manipulation, even outright threats. She criticized David relentlessly, pointing out his lack of ambition, his unconventional career, and his general unsuitability as a husband for her precious daughter. "He's not good enough for you, Clara," she would say, her voice dripping with disdain. "You deserve someone who can provide for you, someone who can give you the life you deserve." Clara tried to reason with her mother, to explain that happiness wasn't about money or status, but about love and companionship. But Mrs. Henderson refused to listen. She was convinced that she knew what was best for her daughter, and she wasn't about to let Clara ruin her life by making the wrong choice. The tension between Clara and her mother reached a boiling point when Mrs. Henderson decided to take matters into her own hands. She started subtly sabotaging Clara and David's relationship, spreading rumors about David to their mutual friends, and even attempting to set Clara up with other, more, the quote, 100 damn men. One evening, Clara received a phone call from a friend, informing her that her mother had been telling everyone that David was secretly in debt and was only dating Clara for her family's money. Clara was furious. She confronted her mother, accusing her of trying to destroy her relationship. Mrs. Henderson denied everything, of course, but Clara could see the guilt in her eyes. "How could you do this to me, Mom?" she cried. "How could you try to ruin my happiness?" "I'm doing it because I love you," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want to see you make a mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life." "But I'm not making a mistake," Clara insisted. "I love David, and he loves me, and that's all that matters." "You're being naive, Clara," Mrs. Henderson said. Love isn't enough. You need someone who can provide for you, someone who can protect you. I don't need protecting, Mom, Clara retorted. I can protect myself, and I don't need someone to provide for me. I can provide for myself. All I need is someone who loves me for who I am. The argument escalated, and soon both women were shouting at the top of their lungs. Finally, Clara stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. She drove to David's apartment, tears streaming down her face. David opened the door and pulled her into a tight embrace. Quoi toi, on 11? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Clara sobbed uncontrollably as she recounted the events of the evening. David listened patiently, holding her close and offering words of comfort. Quote 112, she said finally, her voice hoarse. Quote 113. Quote 114. David said softly. Quote 115. He paused and then added, Quote 116. Clara took a deep breath. Quote 117, she said. Quote 118. She knew this confrontation would be the hardest thing she'd ever done, but she also knew it was the only way to truly be free. She was ready to face her mother, ready to finally claim her own life, and ready to move forward with David no matter what the future held. But facing her mother wasn't quite as straightforward as Clara had imagined. Mrs. Henderson, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, employed a new tactic, the wounded martyr. The constant phone calls complaining about her health, the subtle digs about Clara abandoning her, the carefully constructed sighs of disappointment. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Oh, Clara dear, I just don't know what I'm going to do, Mrs. Henderson would lament, her voice trembling just so. My arthritis is acting up something awful, and I'm just so tired all the time. I don't know how I'll manage the garden this year. Your father always took such pride in it. Clara knew it was a performance, a carefully orchestrated attempt to reel her back in, but a part of her, the part that had been conditioned since childhood to prioritize her mother's needs above her own, still felt a pang of guilt. It was like trying to break free from a physical addiction. The cravings were intense, the withdrawal symptoms almost unbearable. David, ever perceptive, noticed the change in Clara. The newfound confidence seemed to be waning, replaced by a familiar anxiety. Quote 122. Clara hesitated, unsure how to explain the complex web of emotions she was experiencing. Quote 123, she finally admitted. Quote 124. Quote 125. David said gently, taking her hand. Quote 126. He suggested they try a new approach, setting firm boundaries. Easier said than done, of course, but they worked together to create a list of rules. Limited phone calls, no more guilt trips, and absolutely no unsolicited advice about their relationship. Clara would be the one to initiate contact, and she would control the conversation. The first few attempts were disastrous. Mrs. Henderson, unaccustomed to being challenged, reacted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Quote 127. But Clara held her ground, repeating her boundaries calmly and firmly. Quote 128. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but slowly, gradually, Mrs. Henderson began to realize that Clara was serious. The tantrum subsided, replaced by a grudging acceptance. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was progress. Meanwhile, the wedding preparations continued, albeit with a slightly different dynamic. Clara, with David's support, started making her own decisions, choosing the flowers she wanted, the music she liked, and the dress that made her feel beautiful, regardless of her mother's opinion. She even managed to convince Mrs. Henderson to relinquish some control over the guest list, inviting a few of her own friends, people who knew and loved her for who she was, not just as Mrs. Henderson's daughter. One afternoon, while Clara was trying on her wedding dress, her mother came into the room, a rare occurrence these days. Clara braced herself for criticism, but instead, Mrs. Henderson simply stood there, watching her. Quote 129. She said softly, a hint of genuine emotion in her voice. Clara was taken aback. Quote 130. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then added, Voyage, quote 131. Clara's eyes welled up with tears. She knew her mother wasn't going to suddenly transform into a different person, but this small gesture, this moment of genuine connection, meant the world to her. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, their relationship could evolve, could become something healthier, something more balanced. But even as she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope, a nagging voice in the back of her mind reminded her that the wedding was just the beginning. The real test would come after, when she and David started their life together, when the daily challenges of marriage and family began to unfold. Could she truly break free from her mother's influence? Could she create a life of her own, a life defined by her own choices, her own desires? Only time would tell, but for now, in this moment, surrounded by the shimmering fabric of her wedding dress, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope, and a sense of determination. She was ready to face whatever the future held, together with David, and with a newfound understanding of herself and her relationship with her mother. The honeymoon was a blur of idyllic beaches and forced smiles. Sarah tried to relax, to enjoy the sun and the sand, but her mother's voice echoed in her head, a constant stream of anxieties and warnings. Quote 132. Quote 133. Quote 134. Even thousands of miles away, her mother's presence was palpable. David, bless his heart, tried to be patient. He sensed Sarah's unease, her constant checking of her phone, the way she flinched whenever it rang. He tried to reassure her, to draw her out, but it was like trying to coax a frightened bird from its cage. Quote 135. He asked one evening as they sat on their balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues. Sarah jumped, startled. Quote 136. Quote 137. She hesitated. Quote 138. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. Quote 139. She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if searching for some unseen danger. The truth was, she was having a difficult time relaxing. Every decision, every choice, felt weighed down by her mother's expectations. Even something as simple as ordering dinner became a fraught exercise in second-guessing. Would her mother approve of this dish? Would she think it was too unhealthy, too extravagant, too something? Back home, the reality of married life set in with a thud. The picture-perfect image of domestic bliss that Sarah had conjured in her mind quickly shattered against the hard edges of everyday chores and disagreements. The first major clash came over the living room furniture. Sarah had always envisioned a bright, airy space filled with modern pieces and vibrant colors. But her mother had other ideas. Darling, you need something classic, something timeless, her mother had said, her voice dripping with disapproval as she surveyed Sarah's carefully curated Pinterest board. Quote 141. And so, against her better judgment, Sarah found herself agreeing to a bulky, floral-patterned monstrosity that clashed horribly with everything else in the room. David, who had been looking forward to finally having a comfortable couch to relax on, was less than thrilled. Quote 20. He asked, his voice tight with frustration as the delivery men wrestled the offending piece of furniture through the front door. Quote 43. Quote 144. She mumbled, avoiding his gaze. See, that right there? That's the insidious creep of the good girl conditioning. It's not always about shouting matches and blatant control. Sometimes it's a quiet, almost imperceptible erosion of your own desires, a constant deferral to someone else's judgment. And it's exhausting. David just stared at the couch, then back at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. You actually let her pick out our couch? Clara felt a wave of shame wash over her. She knew he was right. She had let her mother bulldoze her. Again. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, she stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to her own ears. Hurt her feelings, David repeated, his voice rising slightly. What about my feelings, Sarah? What about our feelings? This is our apartment, our life together. When are you going to start making decisions for yourself, for us? His words stung, but they were also a wake-up call. He was right. She couldn't keep living her life trying to please everyone but herself. She had to draw a line, and she had to draw it now. Quote, 150, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Quote, 151. The relief on David's face was palpable. Thank you, he said, pulling her into a hug. That means a lot to me. But talking to her mother was easier said than done. Mrs. Henderson, predictably, was not pleased. Return the couch, she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that could shatter glass. Are you out of your mind? I spent hours searching for the perfect couch. It's a family heirloom, practically. Mom, it's not a family heirloom. It's brand new and it doesn't even match our apartment, Clara retorted, trying to remain calm. It's comfortable and it's practical. Unlike that modern garbage you kids are so obsessed with, Mrs. Henderson huffed. Honestly, Sarah, I don't understand you anymore. You're changing. You're not the sweet, considerate girl I raised. And there it was, the ultimate weapon in the arsenal of the overprotective mother, guilt. Clara felt the familiar pang in her chest, the urge to apologize, to recant, to just give in and make her mother happy. But she held firm. Mom, I am still considerate, but I'm also an adult, and I'm allowed to have my own opinions and make my own decisions. David and I don't like the couch, and we're going to return it. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Clara braced herself for another onslaught, but it didn't come. Instead, Mrs. Henderson simply sighed. Quote, Twasti, she said, her voice flat. Quote, Siktivan. And with that, she hung up. Clara stared at the phone, confused. That was it. No yelling, no tears, no emotional blackmail. It was almost anticlimactic. But as the initial shock wore off, a sense of unease settled in. This wasn't like her mother. Something was off. The next few weeks were strangely peaceful. Mrs. Henderson didn't call as often, and when she did, she was surprisingly agreeable. She even complimented Clara's new haircut and expressed interest in David's work. It was as if she had suddenly transformed into a different person. Clara, initially relieved, soon became suspicious. This newfound docility felt calculated, like a predator lying in wait, biding its time before striking, and she was right to be wary. One Saturday morning, Clara and David were having breakfast when the doorbell rang. David opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson standing on the porch, holding a large, elaborately wrapped gift. Quote, 162, she chirped, her smile almost too bright. Quote, 163. David exchanged a wary glance with Clara before inviting her in. Mrs. Henderson placed the gift on the coffee table with a flourish. Quote, 164, she urged, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Clara cautiously unwrapped the gift, revealing a large, framed portrait. It was a picture of Clara and her mother, taken when Clara was a little girl. In the photo, Clara was beaming up at her mother, her eyes filled with adoration. Mrs. Henderson had her arm wrapped protectively around Clara, her expression one of serene contentment. Quote, 165, Mrs. Henderson cooed. Quote, 166. Clara stared at the portrait, a knot forming in her stomach. It wasn't just a picture, it was a statement. A subtle yet powerful reminder of the debt she owed her mother, of the unbreakable connection that bound them together. It was a way of saying, I'm still here, Sarah. I'm still watching over you. Don't forget who you are. David, sensing the tension in the room, put his arm around Clara. It's very thoughtful, Mrs. Henderson, he said politely, but I'm not sure we have room for it. Our walls are already pretty full. Nonsense, Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, waving her hand dismissively. You can always make room for family. Besides, she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I had it specially commissioned. It's quite expensive, you know. Clara felt a surge of anger. This wasn't a gift, it was a manipulation, a way of reasserting her control, of reminding Clara that she was still, in her mother's eyes, the little girl who needed her guidance. Mom, we appreciate the thought, Clara said, her voice tight, but we really don't need it. We have plenty of pictures already. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered. Quote, Waffle 5, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Quote, 176. The wounded martyr routine. Clara had seen it 1,000 times before, but this time it didn't work. This time she was ready. Mom, I know you mean well, she said, her voice firm but gentle. But you need to understand that David and I are building our own life together. We need to make our own decisions, decorate our home in our own way. We love you, but we need some space. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. Quote, line, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Quote, 180. Quote, 181, Clara insisted. Quote, you 182. Quote, 183. Mrs. Henderson scoffed. Okay, quote, 184. And in that moment, Clara realized that she had a long way to go before she could truly break free from her mother's influence. But she also knew that she was on the right path. She had taken the first step, and she wasn't going to back down. The battle for her independence had just begun, and David, bless his heart, was right there beside her, ready to fight. But even he couldn't fully comprehend the depth of the ties that bound Clara to her mother, the subtle ways in which Mrs. Henderson had shaped her desires, her fears, her very identity. The portrait remained, propped against a wall in the spare room, a silent reminder of the power her mother still held. And as Clara looked at the smiling faces in the picture, she couldn't help but wonder, was she truly capable of escaping the shadow of the, quote, 185? Or was she destined to repeat the patterns of the past, forever seeking approval from the woman who had defined her life? The answer, she knew, lay not just in resisting her mother's overt manipulations, but in confronting the deep-seated beliefs that had been ingrained in her since childhood. Beliefs about duty, obligation, and the unwavering importance of pleasing others, even at the expense of her own happiness. It was a daunting task, but Clara was determined to succeed, for her own sake and for the sake of her relationship with David. The next few weeks were a blur of wedding decisions, each one a battleground. Mrs. Henderson wanted a grand, traditional affair at the country club, the same venue where Clara's older sister Emily had gotten married. Clara, however, envisioned something smaller, more intimate, perhaps a garden wedding with close friends and family. The clashes were constant, exhausting. Every seating chart suggestion, every flower arrangement choice, every linen color became a point of contention. Clara tried to stand her ground, but the weight of her mother's disappointment, the constant reminders of all the sacrifices Mrs. Henderson had made, chipped away at her resolve. David, witnessing the escalating tension, tried to intervene, but Mrs. Henderson skillfully deflected his attempts, painting him as an outsider who didn't understand the importance of family traditions. Quote 186. She'd say, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness, and David, unsure of how to navigate this complex dynamic, would retreat, leaving Clara to fight her battles alone. One evening, after a particularly grueling dress fitting, where Mrs. Henderson had insisted on a voluminous gown that Clara felt swallowed her whole, Clara finally broke down. She sat on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her face, feeling utterly defeated. "I can't do this, David," she sobbed into the phone. "I can't keep fighting her on every single thing. It's exhausting. I just want to be happy." David, his voice filled with concern, tried to reassure her. "Clara, you are strong. You've come so far. Don't let her wear you down. This is your wedding, your life. You deserve to have what you want." But Clara's doubts lingered. Was she being selfish? Was she disrespecting her mother? Was she making a mistake by going against her wishes? The Che Shas quote 190. Conditioning was deeply ingrained, whispering insidious messages of guilt and obligation. She remembered all the times she had suppressed her own desires to please her mother, the countless sacrifices she had made to maintain the peace. And now, faced with the biggest decision of her life, she was struggling to break free from that pattern. David, sensing her hesitation, suggested they take a break from the wedding planning, a weekend getaway to clear their heads and reconnect. They drove to a secluded cabin in the mountains, surrounded by towering trees and breathtaking views. Away from the constant pressure of her mother's expectations, Clara began to breathe again. They hiked, they talked, they laughed, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt a sense of peace. David, sensing her vulnerability, gently encouraged her to confront her feelings, to explore the roots of her anxiety and self-doubt. He didn't offer easy answers or quick fixes, but simply listened, providing a safe space for her to process her emotions. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, David asked her a simple question. Quote 191:1. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Clara stared into the flames, searching for an answer within herself. It was a question she had never truly allowed herself to consider, always prioritizing the needs and expectations of others above her own. But now, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the mountains, she felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, she could break free from the chains of her past and create a future that was truly her own. Maybe she could finally define herself, not as the quote 192 her mother had always wanted her to be, but as the woman she was meant to be. The answer, she realized, was not about rebellion or defiance, but about self-discovery and self-acceptance. It was about recognizing her own worth, her own desires, and having the courage to pursue them, even if it meant disappointing her mother. It was about choosing her own happiness, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. And as she looked at David, his eyes filled with love and understanding, she knew that she wasn't alone in this journey. She had found someone who believed in her, who supported her, who loved her for who she was, not for who she was expected to be. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. But the path to that realization was far from smooth. The engagement party was a minefield of subtle jabs and passive-aggressive comments from Eleanor. "David seems nice, dear," she'd said, her tone suggesting anything but. Quote 194. Sarah had forced a smile. Quote 195. Quote 196. She let the sentence hang, a clear implication that David wasn't financially up to par. David, bless his heart, had overheard. Later, he'd taken Sarah's hand, his eyes filled with concern. "Your mother seems to have some reservations about me. Is she always like this?" Sarah sighed. "It's not you, David, it's her. She's always been this way. She has very specific ideas about what's best for me, and she struggles to accept that I might have different ideas." "But what do you want, Sarah? Not what your mother wants, but what you truly desire." That question hung in the air, heavy and profound. What did she want? For so long, her desires had been so intertwined with her mother's expectations that she barely knew where one ended and the other began. Did she want the grand house, the prestigious career, the perfectly polished life that Eleanor envisioned for her? Or did she want something simpler, something more authentic, something that resonated with her own soul? The wedding preparations were a battleground. Eleanor insisted on a lavish affair at the country club, a guest list filled with influential people, a designer dress that cost more than David's car. Sarah, increasingly suffocated by the pressure, found herself pushing back, subtly at first, then with growing assertiveness. "Mom, I appreciate you wanting to help, but David and I want a smaller wedding, something more intimate, with just our closest friends and family." Eleanor's face tightened. Quote, "Choose one." Quote, "22." Quote, "23." The dress was another point of contention. Eleanor had chosen an elaborate gown with layers of lace and a train that stretched for miles. Sarah, however, had found a simple, elegant dress that felt more like her. Quote, 204. Eleanor had said, her voice dripping with disapproval. Quote, 205. Sarah stood her ground, a small act of rebellion that felt surprisingly empowering. Quote, 206. Eleanor sighed dramatically, a performance she had perfected over the years. Quote, 207. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with similar skirmishes. The flowers, the music, the guest list, everything was a negotiation, a tug-of-war between Sarah's desires and her mother's expectations. David, ever supportive, tried to mediate, but even his gentle nature couldn't always soothe the tension. "It's okay, Sarah," he'd say, holding her close. Quote 209. And Sarah would cling to those words, reminding herself that this wedding, this life, was about her and David, not about fulfilling her mother's vision. But the constant pressure was taking its toll. She found herself snapping at David, doubting her own choices, and feeling increasingly overwhelmed. The joy she should have been feeling was overshadowed by a persistent sense of anxiety. One evening, a week before the wedding, Sarah found herself alone in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by wedding magazines and fabric swatches. She looked around at the familiar surroundings, the floral wallpaper, the carefully arranged dolls on the shelf, and a wave of sadness washed over her. This room, this house, had always been her sanctuary, but now it felt like a gilded cage. She picked up a framed photograph of herself and her mother, taken years ago. In the picture, Sarah was a little girl, smiling brightly, her arm around her mother's waist. Eleanor was beaming, her eyes filled with pride. Sarah traced her finger over the image, wondering when their relationship had become so complicated. When had her mother's love turned into control? Suddenly, she had enough. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't spend the rest of her life trying to please her mother, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a false sense of peace. She needed to break free, to assert her own identity, to finally become the woman she was meant to be. She grabbed her phone and dialed David's number. Quote, 210, she said, her voice trembling. Quote, 215. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Quote, 212. Quote, 213, she said, tears streaming down her face. Quote, 214. Quote, 215, David said, his voice calm and reassuring. Quote, 216. When David arrived, Sarah was a mess. She was pacing back and forth, her hands shaking, her eyes red and swollen. David took her in his arms and held her tight. Quote, "Dr. Tau, you're 17, he whispered. Quote, "You toured already 19. Quote, "2 to 19, she sobbed. Quote, "You're 20 tai." David held her tighter. Quote, "You're 21. That night, they talked for hours, weighing their options, considering the consequences. They could elope, they could postpone the wedding, they could try to reason with Mrs. Henderson. But none of those options felt quite right. Finally, Sarah had an idea. Quote, 222. David looked at her, surprised. Quote, 23. Quote, 24. Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. Quote, 225. David hesitated. Quote, 226. Quote, 227. Sarah admitted. Quote, 208. After a few moments of consideration, David smiled. Quote, 229, he said. Quote, 230. And so they did. They found a charming little garden nestled in the countryside, a place that felt intimate and romantic. They invited their closest friends and family, people who truly loved and supported them. They chose the flowers, the music, the food, everything that reflected their personalities and their love for each other. The day of the wedding arrived, and Sarah was a bundle of nerves and excitement. She got ready in secret, surrounded by her closest friends, feeling more beautiful and confident than she had ever felt before. She wore the simple, elegant dress she had chosen, the one that made her feel like herself. As she walked down the aisle, she saw David standing at the end, his eyes filled with love and admiration. And in that moment, she knew she was making the right decision. This was her life, her love, her wedding. After the ceremony, as the guests mingled and celebrated, Sarah knew she couldn't put it off any longer. She had to tell her mother. She found Eleanor standing near the buffet table, chatting with a group of friends. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Mom," she said, her voice steady, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Eleanor turned around, her eyes widening in surprise. "Sarah, darling, what is it? You look radiant." Sarah took her mother's hand and led her to a quiet corner of the garden. Quote, 234. She said, quote, 235. Eleanor's smile faltered. "What is it, dear? You're starting to scare me." Sarah took a deep breath. "Mom, this is my wedding." Eleanor stared at her, her mouth agape. What? What are you talking about? Your wedding is next week at the country club." "No, Mom," Sarah said gently. "This is my wedding. David and I decided to get married today in a way that felt right for us." Eleanor's face turned red with anger. "Quote 2401. Quote 242, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Quote 243. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted you to be happy, Sarah," she said, her voice cracking. "I wanted you to have the perfect wedding, the perfect life." "I know, Mom," Sarah said, reaching out to hug her mother. "And I appreciate that, but I need to find my own happiness in my own way. And this is it, Mom. This is my happiness." Eleanor pulled away, her expression softening slightly. She looked around at the garden, at the smiling faces of the guests, at the love in Sarah's eyes, and slowly a small smile appeared on her face. Quote 248, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Quote 249. Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her face. Quote 250, she said. Quote 251. As the evening wore on, Eleanor slowly began to relax and enjoy herself. She chatted with the guests, complimented Sarah on her dress, and even danced with David. And as Sarah watched her mother laughing and smiling, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had finally broken free from her mother's control. Maybe, just maybe, she could finally be herself. Years passed. Sarah and David built a beautiful life together, filled with love, laughter, and adventure. They had 2 children, a boy